Namaste.
Namaste, Professor Jeffrey Long. I've been in touch with you now almost 2 decades now. The time flew by. And very happy to be able to speak with you on Skype. We keep meeting in conferences and so on. We met, I think, last 15 years ago at the Vedanta Congress in Florida first time, and then at the AR, and then last month in Chicago, and so on. I'd like to share your life story, your so many books that you have already published, and so many other more books you are going to publish soon. And so your projects and so on. But let's start with your own life story, how you became interested in India studies, Hindu studies. So over to you, Professor Jeffrey Long in Pennsylvania.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Pankaj Bhai, for inviting me here, and I'm happy to share all of this with you and anyone who cares to listen. I did not grow up in India. I grew up in Missouri. I sometimes joke about Missouri and Mussoorie. These are very similar names, from India and the U.S. But I grew up in a small town in Missouri. I grew up in the Roman Catholic faith. And I was from a very small family. It's just my parents and myself, but large extended family and fairly traditional, I would say, somewhat conservative American family. And I grew up with a big love for science fiction. So Star Trek and Star Wars, these things were very, very big part of my life, and I still love these things. And so those were the kinds of interests I had as a child. And I would say I had a pretty happy childhood. I was good in school. My parents and my grandparents, everyone was very proud of me, and things were going well. But when I was about to turn 11 years old, my mother and I got a phone call in the middle of the night, 3 a.m. My father had been in a terrible accident, and he was paralyzed from his shoulders down. He was rendered quadriplegic. And for the next year and a half, our lives were centered around taking care of him. He was in the hospital for several months, but then he finally came home. We converted a room into basically a hospital room, and my mother took care of him, and I did whatever I could to help. So it was really a tragic time. It was a very, very hard time for our family. And so my father he was very depressed. He had always been a very physically active person. He was a musician and a carpenter, and he had all kinds of physical interests, and he could now do nothing. And he was a veteran of the Vietnam War. So through the Veterans Administration, he was given this really nice, at that time, really high-tech wheelchair, which he was able to control with a lever with his mouth. And this gave him some independence. He was able to go outdoors, and we would go with him, to be sure everything was okay. And he was always very independent, and he got very angry with this eventually. He said, just let me go on my own. I'll be okay. So we were absolutely terrified, but he would go out on his own, and it was a very small town, so people knew him, and everyone said hello to him, and knew who he was. But we didn't realize what he had in mind. When I was 12, this was the summer of 1981, he placed himself in the path of an oncoming train and ended his own life that way. And we're pretty certain that this was deliberate, that it was not an accident, and it was something that just really was I would say probably a defining event in my life. I knew nothing about India or Indian philosophy or Vedanta at that time, but I had several intuitions at that point, and one of them was when my father had been injured. I really realized that we are not this physical body. This physical body is not who we are. It's our vehicle. It's our point of interface between our consciousness and the material world. But we are not this body. And I became convinced of that because I saw my father's body become a prison for his spirit. And I really believe that when he ended his life, he was actually freeing himself from that imprisonment. And I never blamed him for that. I was very sympathetic to what he did. But it was still very shocking and very troubling for all of us in the family and in the whole community because it's such a small town. It was a very public event. One of the churches it was a Sunday evening, and one of the churches had just gotten out. So there were a whole bunch of people around when this happened. I was playing at a friend's house, and I didn't even know. My grandparents came and told us that he had passed away and what had happened. So this led me to really reflect very, very deeply about religion and philosophy, and I wanted answers to the big questions. Why do these things happen? Why do we suffer so much? What happens after we die? If we're not the body, if we're something else, where does that something else go when the body is no more? And of course, growing up in the Catholic Church, there were teachings about that. There was the idea of heaven and hell. But that always bothered me because if you think about the traditional Christian teaching, it's, after you die, after you have this very short, finite lifespan, there's this infinity, eternity of either heaven or hell. And my experience was that nobody I knew seemed to be either good enough to go to heaven or bad enough to go to hell. Infinity is a long, long time. Like even someone like Hitler, you might imagine maybe he should suffer for billions of years for what he did. But billions of years is still finite. It's not forever and ever and ever with no hope of any kind of redemption. So the thought that entered my mind was that there was this Catholic idea of purgatory, where there's this sort of intermediate place where you go if you're basically, in what they call in a state of grace. You're headed for heaven, but you're not quite purified. You're not quite yet ready for that. So there's this intermediate state called purgatory. And my thought was, well, maybe we're already in purgatory. Maybe this is purgatory, and we just keep coming back here until we are purified, right? Until we figure out and learn what we need to learn and move on. So I was already thinking this way before I knew about Indian philosophy. So for me, it was almost instinctive. And then several things happened. I really think for Americans, popular culture serves the role that the Ramayana and Mahabharata do in India, that we think through our popular culture. And so two pop culture sources really kind of awakened my mind to think about India. One was the Beatles, the music of the Beatles, which I had really gotten a love for around the time my father died. And he was a fan also. And one of the things he had me do was record all of his records on cassette tapes, and then he could control that with his mouth control device that he had. And so I taped all his Beatles records, and I just really enjoyed them. And as probably many listeners know, the Beatles, especially George Harrison, had a very deep interest in Hinduism. Went to India. And George Harrison was the most serious. He went many times to India. Good friend with Ravi Shankar. Very close with Srila Prabhupada, who started ISKCON, and really was very serious about it throughout the rest of his life. And this made a deep impression on me. I was just very drawn to this idea of this Indian spirituality. It just seemed very profound. And then I saw the movie Gandhi when it came out in 1982, and that really impressed me as well. My heroes before that were, Luke Skywalker and Captain Kirk. They were fighting bad guys with, lightsabers and phasers. Here was someone who fought with the power of truth, and who fought without doing harm. And I was very captivated by that. So I started reading everything I could find on Gandhi. I started, when I was delving more and more into the Beatles, and reading about Gandhi, and then also in some of the record album cover art of George Harrison, there were these references to the Bhagavad-Gita. And I thought, well, this must be a very important book. I need to find this Bhagavad-Gita. It was not in our local library. I had read all three of our books on world religions that were in the local library, and nothing was there. And one day it was really interesting. I just sort of came across it. I was with my grandmother at a sale. This is what they call a flea market. People sell old things, and this was in the parking lot of the Methodist Church in the town where I grew up. And I had been thinking about, Bhagavad Gita, but I wasn't thinking I would find it there, but I found it there. I was looking at a display, and people had a bunch of old magazines and books and paperbacks. And I love books, so I thought that'll be interesting. And there's the Bhagavad Gita right on top, and it was the very elaborately illustrated ISKCON version of Prabhupada, the Bhagavad Gita as it is, as it's called. I opened it. It has these beautiful illustrations. I opened it, sort of randomly, and I saw this picture. One of the illustrations is of this man who has died, and he's surrounded by his mourning family. And you see a Hindu monk sort of standing to the side observing, and he sees Lord Krishna in the hearts of every one of these beings. And there's a quotation at the bottom. It says, "The wise lament for neither the living nor the dead." And it gave a page number. And so I looked up that page number, and it was chapter 2, verse 11 of the Gita, where Lord Krishna is saying to Arjuna that there was never a time when you and I did not exist, nor any future when we will cease to be. Just as someone casts off old and worn out clothing and puts on a new set of clothing, so the soul casts off the body at death and takes on a new body, continues its journey. It says the wise are not deluded by these changes. And I joke that this is when I became a born again Hindu, because I really felt that this ancient book from the other side of the world was speaking directly to me and to my experience and confirming what I was already sort of starting to think in my mind. And so I bought the Gita for a quarter, the best quarter I ever spent, I think. And that really, I think, is what set me off on my life journey. Because from then on, I wanted to study everything I could about India, about Hinduism. I was really interested in studying all the world's religions. I explored Chinese philosophy, Islam, many, many different things. But what I sort of came back to was the Bhagavad-Gita, because it just made such sense to me. The vision in the Gita, the vision of Vedanta. So to kind of move the story ahead a little bit, I read a lot. I mean, I was 14 when I found the Gita, so all through the rest of middle school and high school, I was reading Houston Smith's World Religions book. Paramahansa Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi, Aldous Huxley's The Perennial Philosophy, Swami Rama's Living with the Himalayan Masters. These are all books that I read, and multiple translations of the Bhagavad Gita. Like I collect Bhagavad Gitas basically. Now I have, and each one gives a different picture. And then eventually I made it to college and took courses with Paul Griffiths, who at that time was a scholar of Buddhism. He shifted over into Catholic studies now and is at Duke University, but he was at University of Notre Dame at that time, which is a Catholic university, which is where I went to college. And I was studying philosophy and theology. I knew I wanted to be a writer. I knew I wanted to be a professor because I wanted to talk about and share these ideas that had inspired me so much with as many people as I could. Another big inspiration for me was Joseph Campbell. His TV series, The Power of Myth, came out when I was in high school. And he was sort of like a Carl Sagan of religious studies. And I thought, I'd like to do something like that. I want to talk about these awesome things for a living. So when I took Paul Griffith's courses, first course I took with him was a survey of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism. And the second day of class, I followed him back to his office. And almost like he was my guru, I said, I want to do what you do. I want to teach classes like this. So guide me. So he became my guide, and he recommended that I apply to University of Chicago for graduate school, and which is where I went next and sort of continued my journey. And now this is sort of, I guess you could say, the intellectual side of the journey, the professional side of the journey. On the personal side, I felt myself so drifting further and further away from the Catholic Church. I went to a Catholic university, so I was completely surrounded by the Catholic Church. I have a very high regard for the Catholic Church, but I was seeing limitations in the theology. From my point of view, the Hindu theology, the Vedanta, was much more expansive in its vision, and this is really what I identified with. And I met a professor at Notre Dame who was another professor, Stephen Fredman, who is a devotee of Guru Mai in the Siddha Yoga lineage. So she was the successor of Swami Muktananda in that tradition. So I began practicing in that tradition for a period of several years and had very good experiences. And through meditation and the Shaktipat experience was very profound. So this sort of all confirmed me on this spiritual path. And then simultaneously, I was taking the intellectual route of studying at Chicago to be a scholar of religion.
Okay, that was a interesting summary of your journey from Missouri to Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's focus on, let's hear from you how your experience was in Chicago. Chicago was obviously the place where Swami Vivekananda, the first Hindu to come to North America 125 years ago. And yes, Chicago was also the place, Chicago is also the place where you became a professor, a scholar, a PhD in Hinduism. Mm-hmm. And then eventually you also adopted the name Vivekananda. So,
right.
If you would like to share that part of your journey.
Sure, I'll be very happy to talk about that. So, yeah, Chicago was a very important phase in my life. Several things happened there. One, probably the most significant, was I met my wife. I was living in the International House as a dorm for graduate students, and I was studying Sanskrit. And I was taking courses from various professors at Chicago, and also making friends there, other students. And my wife, her name is Mahua. She is a professor of Japanese. And in fact, for the last 19 years, we've both been teaching in the same college here in Pennsylvania, Elizabethtown College. And she's from India, and she grew up Hindu, and she's Bengali, and as many Bengalis families do, Bengali families do. Her family had a very close association with the Ramakrishna mission, the Ramakrishna tradition, which I had also read about and studied through reading Houston Smith's work and Aldous Huxley and various other people. And I knew Chicago was a very significant place because that's where Swamiji first came to America, gave the very renowned, welcome address, Sisters and Brothers of America. And in fact, the place where he gave the speech today is the Museum of the Art Institute. And I actually taught part-time at the Art Institute for a while, and it was a big honor to be there. I taught a course on Indian philosophy for 3 years when I was still doing my dissertation, and it was wonderful to work there and to be in that space. And there are all kinds of commemorations of it there. They have the welcome address on these steps. They have the steps sort of lit up with the words of the speech, and you can see that in Chicago. And then that portion of Michigan Avenue where the Art Institute is, they're called Vivekananda Marg now, so it's named after him. So it's a wonderful thing. In terms of my name, this is an interesting thing. So when Mahua and I met, we decided very quickly we wanted to get married. I mean, within a month of having met, we wanted to get married. And our friends who know us, one person said it was almost like an arranged marriage, but without the arrangement. We just like intuitively knew that we were, we were best friends. We had many of the same thoughts and interests. So we got married. Now it's interesting. Mahua at that time was still teaching in India. And I think some of your listeners may be interested in this because I was at University of Chicago, which is in some ways very notorious among many Hindus because some of the scholarship that's come out of Chicago is something that people are very critical of, and I think for good reasons. Another university that a lot of Hindus are very critical of is JNU in India, and that's where my wife used to teach. So we're both connected with these two sort of very notorious places. But we both had good experiences. She had a lot of good experiences in JNU. She did her degrees there and was hired there and was teaching. So she had to go back and teach. We met in the summer of '93. And so we had to part, and it was very sad for us. So I went to Paul Griffiths, who had been teaching at Notre Dame, but he actually went to Chicago around the same time I was applying there. So I continued to work with him, and he was my advisor throughout my time at Chicago. And so I went to him, and I told him the whole story. I said, I've met this person, and we want to get married. We want to be together, but I want to finish my PhD. I know I need to go to India anyway to learn about the country and experience it and do field work and so on. So normally you would do that near the end of your PhD when you're writing your dissertation. But I said to him, "Can I just go now? Is that okay?" He said, "Sure, go." So I was in India for almost 2 years, and we got married through the Arya Samaj at the Arya Samaj Mandir in Vasant Vihar. And we picked the Arya Samaj not because we are especially drawn to the Arya Samaj. We're more Ramakrishna mission people. But the Arya Samaj does the very basic Vedic wedding. It's very simple. It's very beautiful. And interestingly, we found out something when we went to the Arya Samaj. The priest, the pandit there, told us that I would need to become Hindu to have a Hindu wedding through the Arya Samaj. And Mahua and her father both, again, being good Ramakrishna mission people, they thought, making someone convert, that's not very Hindu. We don't believe in conversion. And then I said, this is great. I said, this is my opportunity to really formally kind of declare to the world, this is where I am, right? Because I had stopped going to the church many, many years ago, and I'd been practicing Siddha Yoga. Siddha Yoga, after a period of time, I was involved less and less because I was so busy as a student at Chicago. They make you take so many classes. So much of your time you're studying that I sort of neglected my spiritual life in that sense, and I sort of just kind of drifted from that. But my heart was still there. My belief was still there. And so when they said, "Oh, you need to become Hindu," I was like, "Great, that's perfect. I want to be Hindu. I think of myself as sort of Hindu anyway. I'm not Indian, but this is my worldview, my belief system, my way of understanding things. I loved living in India, and the people are great in India. I mean, India has its challenges, but those are all on the sort of physical level. But just the people are so warm and kind, and you're experiencing this all the time." And so I said, yeah, I want to be Hindu. So part of that was taking a Hindu name. And my Mahua's father, soon then to become my father-in-law, had this idea that since I studied at Chicago and I was studying Sanskrit and Hinduism and these things, I should be named Vivekananda. So that is what the priest named me, and that is my Hindu name. Now, I've had conversations with people before who say, well, why don't you use your Hindu name all the time? Why don't you publish and speak as Vivekananda? There's a reason for that, actually, which is in the Ramakrishna tradition, this name is special. And of course, there are many, many Hindu guys named Vivek or Vivekananda. It's not an unusual thing. But in the Ramakrishna tradition, even the Swamis don't take the name Vivekananda. That name is never recycled. And so I've always thought that if I did that, the Swamis might think I was, I don't know, being arrogant or, sort of trying to, claim something for myself that is greater than what I would want to claim. But I'm very proud to have that name. It's a profound honor to have it. So I don't mind people knowing that and being aware of it. But that's why I don't sort of use it all. I don't want to abuse it. So it's special. I keep it special. Whenever we do pujas or anything like that, you have to give your name and your gotra and so on to the priest. And that's my name that I use in that context. So
yeah, because we met in Chicago last month, and I thought it just came to me now to ask you this question, that Chicago is the place where he spoke in 1893. Chicago is the place where you got a PhD in Hinduism.
yes.
And then I was reminded that you took this name, and that's why I asked this question. I didn't mean to ask this, but
Oh yeah, it's just all kinds of things converged there, and it was really really interesting. And something else about Chicago, I think people might be interested in is, of course, probably the most well-known professor from Chicago for many Hindus is Wendy Doniger, who's very very controversial because of her writings on Hinduism. She was one of my teachers, and people may be interested in what was that like? What would and how did that relationship go? And it is very interesting. I would say in terms of our worldviews and our ways of looking at the world and life, there are probably no two people more different than Wendy and myself. And we had always sort of friendly debates about things. But I would say on a personal level, she was always very warm, very friendly, very caring, and really a very supportive teacher. I had Chicago can be a tough place. It's very they call it intellectual boot camp, right? It's you're learning a very tough intellectual discipline there. There's a lot of skepticism. Every claim you make has to be backed up with arguments and evidence and logic, and that's why I went there. I wanted to have that sort of very tough, rigorous experience because then that makes you able to argue better and make your case for things and really to be taken more seriously as a scholar. So I wanted that experience. But it's hard. I mean, if you find your values, your beliefs, and everything that you love being sort of abused on a daily basis, it is hard. And then add to that the fact that the weather is horrible there. That it's so you trudge out of International House and you walk down the street in 0-degree weather and high wind, and then you hear all kinds of things about how the Bhagavad-Gita was interpolated into the Mahabharata, and it's actually a bunch of different things, and I mean just constant sort of engagement with this kind of debate, but it sharpens your mind. And so I'm very grateful for having that experience. So I think it's possible to disagree with what scholars say, and yet on a personal level respect that they're teaching you something. And if you think of it from a Vedantic perspective, everybody we meet is a form of divinity. Everybody, whether they're your friend or your enemy, whether they're your family member, your child, your parent, these are all God speaking to us. So I think we can, as Hindus, if I can call myself Hindu and no one's offended by that, we can disagree with things that a professor like Wendy Doniger might say, and yet see God in her also. And I think that's very important. I think in our world today, there's not enough of that. And so we hate the people we disagree with. And then we see horrible things. I mean, I'm still in shock, I think, a little from what happened at the synagogue in Pittsburgh on Saturday. This was just not that far from where we live in Elizabethtown. My wife's cousin lives in Pittsburgh. There's a Vedanta society in Pittsburgh. We know the people there. And I don't know anyone from that synagogue, but it was very close. And our local Hindu temple is now looking very seriously at security and also doing outreach to the people from the synagogue and showing interfaith support. But also, having to think about the fact that there are these deranged people out there. So we really have to learn to all disagree in a more Vedantic way. I think the great acharyas were able to debate with each other very vigorously, but no one killed each other or hurt each other in any way. So I think that should be our model.
Right. That's the last few sentences reminded me of your Jain connection. You also bring in a lot of Anekantavad and Syadvad in your writing, in your thinking. So tell us how you connect Jainism with your process theology and Hindu Vedantic.
Okay, very good. And that sort of goes back to my Chicago days, because when I was thinking of what I wanted to do for my dissertation, again, my main professor, my main teacher there was Paul Griffiths, who's a philosopher of religion. So I went into the philosophy of religion area, which they had just developed at Chicago. And I wanted to give a good, rigorous argument that would sort of pass the tests of these, skeptics at Chicago. For Ramakrishna's teaching, yato mat tato pat, that there is every system of belief and practice is a path to ultimate truth, and it's a sentiment that's very widespread in the Hindu community, but it's kind of it risks becoming sort of a platitude. People say this, many paths to one truth, but no one really studies other traditions to really see what the differences are and so on. So I wanted to argue for this in a rigorous way, and I also wanted to, of course, show one of the things I had to show was, mastery of at least one system of Indian philosophy. And I was reading a book by B.K. Maltilal, Bimal Krishna Maltilal. It was a wonderful book on logic, language, and reality. It's mostly about Nyaya, but he also has a large section on Jainism, and he talks about Anekantavad and Syadvad. And then he has another book that's just on Anekantavad, which really influenced my thinking a lot. And what I found with Anekantavad was that even though in my mind I associate this teaching of many paths to truth with Sri Ramakrishna, and you find it in many Indian traditions, I think the Jains, more than any other community, developed this into a rigorous system of logic that can really address the question, how is it that different paths, which teach different things, and which sometimes contradict one another, how can these all be true in some sense? And I think the Jains really took that question very, very seriously and developed a complex system of logic that sort of breaks the claims of a tradition down to their core metaphysical principles. And if you come down to the core metaphysical principles, you find that they are not necessarily incompatible. In fact, they can be complementary to one another. And this is something else that Swami Vivekananda says. He says, how can all these different paths be, how can they all be true? And he says, well, they are. He uses the term supplementary. I think he says complementary at one point as well. But they can be combined in a synthesis that is not incoherent, but that's internally consistent and logical. And Pravajika Vrajaprana, who's a very good friend of mine and a mentor of mine in the Ramakrishna tradition, she writes that the various religions and philosophies can be likened to pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Mm-hmm. And I grew up solving jigsaw puzzles. I love these. I played these all the time as a child. And, each piece of a puzzle is different. Mm-hmm. They're not the same, right? In the same way, it's wrong if we say religions are the same. They're not the same. They're different, but you can fit these pieces together and they form a larger picture. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that Jainism was a great help in developing this idea of pluralism, as scholars call it, this idea of many paths to one truth. Now, another important piece of that, which you mentioned, is process theology, which goes back to the English philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. who was a friend and colleague of Bertrand Russell, and was originally quite a skeptic. But after he lost his son in the First World War, and he became very interested in the spiritual side of life. And he develops this way of thinking, which has many, many affinities with Indian philosophy. A lot of people have written about how similar his process thought is to Buddhism. What I found was that it's also very close to Jainism, and that if you draw together, if you sort of synthesize Whitehead's thought and Jain philosophy, Anekantavad, you get this very kind of comprehensive picture of reality that can incorporate dimensions of many different traditions and philosophies into this larger synthesis. And I found that Whitehead's thinking is a good way to sort of translate Indian philosophical concepts into the idiom of the Western world, because, of course, ideally everyone will use the Sanskrit terms, and that's what people like you and I are trying to very patiently and gently teach people, right? Use the Sanskrit term because it doesn't mean the same thing often as the English term. But that one way of sort of drawing these two traditions together is through this system of Whitehead's thought. I think he was probably an Indian philosopher in a previous life. Um, he was well read in Indian philosophy, and some have accused him of appropriating things, cultural appropriation without attributing. I think some of that might have happened, but I suspect it was more unconscious, that his thinking was just very much in line with this way of thinking. And what I've tried to do, and now other people are also doing, Andrew Schwartz has a book out that's doing this. Brianne Donaldson's done this, some of this in her work, showing how with this sort of synthesis of Whitehead's thought and Jain thought, you can make a very, very powerful argument, not only for pluralism, but for an ecological vision of reality, which I know is very close to your work and to what you do. And I think these two things, ecology and pluralism, are really essential to human survival right now. The two big threats to us at the moment are climate change, which comes from our unbridled consumerism and materialism, and conflict between worldviews, which leads us to destroy the environment and each other. And these things feed into one another because as things get worse on Earth due to climate change, we're going to have to cooperate with one another to share the resources. And if we still hate each other because we have different worldviews, that's going to be very difficult, and we're really imperiling ourselves. So I think Indian philosophy and process thought, and I think these really provide intellectual tools which can, in combination with science, really help us save humanity and pave the way for the future.
Right, wonderful. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about your work in progress, which is Hinduism in America.
Yes.
So please tell us how that work is going on.
Okay, I'm very excited about this work. The title of this book, it's a textbook that's going to be coming out from Bloomsbury, hopefully in early 2019. Now, last year I said it would be coming out hopefully in early 2018, but I've gotten bogged down in many, many projects, and the work has gotten slowed. But I'm very excited about it. It's called Hinduism in America, and the subtitle is A Convergence of Worlds. And I call it a convergence of worlds because I'm trying to do something a little different in this book from what I've seen in other books on Hinduism in America. There are two types of books on Hinduism in America. One focuses on the Hindu community, the heritage Hindu community coming from India, settling in America, adapting to American culture and life, preserving Hindu traditions, and so on. Another type of book, which you see, like Phil Goldberg's American Veda, for example, is about Westerners who get excited about and drawn to Hindu traditions and Hindu spiritual teachers, and how that has affected American culture in various ways as well. And the people who are experts in one of those tend to not know as much about the other, and vice versa. And so, what I want to do is bring those two conversations together. I'm not saying I'm the first to have ever done this, but I think it's going to be the first textbook that really tries to do this. That is both a chronicle of the coming of the Hindu immigrant community into America. This community struggles with racism, with misunderstandings of the tradition, with various kinds of issues that have come up through the years, stereotypes and so on. And then simultaneously, you have these sort of crazy Americans like me who get all excited about this and have gurus and Indian names and that sort of thing. And how do these two things fit together? Because what I'm seeing in more recent years is as the second and even third generation of Hindus grow up in America, the difference between growing up Hindu in America and being a non-Indian or a person who's not ethnically, drawn from the Hindu sort of descent, uh, getting drawn to the tradition. The differences between those two are less and less, and you even see non-Indian uh, people teaching Hinduism to children in temples and that sort of thing. And you have traditions like you have the Swamis from Hinduism today who are almost entirely of sort of European ancestry. And in the Vedanta Society, we have most of our Swamis are from India, but we have quite a few who are not. And we were sort of the pioneers in that regard. So you have this convergence of worlds. You have this coming together of two groups of people, and sometimes there's conflict. I think that if you are Indian in America and you want to preserve your Hindu traditions and keep them as much like they were in India as possible, this is sort of a conservative outlook. You're concerned about preserving things and passing them on to the next generation intact. If you're the kind of Westerner who's drawn to Hinduism, you're a bit of a rebel. You don't mind leaving your church or your synagogue and trying something entirely new, and thinking outside the box and so forth. So there can be a mismatch, I think, very often between the interests of these two groups. But I find they often converge, and as the idea of what Hinduism is becomes clearer in people's minds, I think there is more of a convergence, and you see a lot more Westerners who want to be very serious Hindus, and they'll be quite critical of, for example, some of the people who perpetuate yoga, but without actually connecting it with Indian philosophy or with Hinduism at all. And so the interests of these two are really coming together more and more. Our first Hindu representative in Congress, Tulsi Gabbard, is actually not someone of Indian descent. She's someone whose parents took up a Vaishnava tradition, and she was raised in that tradition. And now we have four Hindus in Congress, but she was the first and probably the best known. And so these two are coming together in all kinds of interesting ways. So that's the focus of my book is these two communities gradually merging as one and forming what we now think of as Hinduism in America.
Oh, okay, wonderful. All right. Okay. You also have other projects that probably we can, since we discussed pluralism and Kantvad, maybe we can talk about your article, hopefully coming up soon in my own volume for Bloomsbury.
Yes.
You connect Anekantvad and with the book Kali's Child and that controversy, and how that book could have been a different one.
Right.
If you applied Anekantvad.
That's right. That's right. Because I think that a lot of and this sort of goes back to some of what we were talking about with Wendy Doniger and so forth. A lot of the conflict that emerges between Western scholars of Hinduism and the Hindu community, some of it I think comes from very different starting points in terms of worldview, and what I would broadly call materialism or physicalism is a very widespread philosophical position in the academy. It's sort of taken as the default position that if you're an intelligent thinking person and a scholar, that you don't believe in God or a soul or a higher consciousness or anything of that sort, that it's all material reality that you can see with the senses, and things are very quickly reduced to material factors. So psychological forces or economic forces, these are sort of the two, right? I mean, if you think of the Purusharthas in Hinduism, you have dharma and then artha, kama, moksha. And I think in the minds of many Hindus, dharma and moksha are really important. And if you're writing about Hinduism, you should be talking about dharma. That is, you should be talking about values and what people do and how they understand it, or moksha, the spiritual path. But the focus of a lot of our scholars is on artha and kama. Artha in the sense of economic forces. So a lot of scholarship on Hinduism is focused on how it's implicated with power relations in India and so on. And then you have kama, the focus on the psychological impulses, and of course the whole Freudian approach is there. And what I suggested in my paper was that if we look at it from the lens of Anekantavada, we don't have to reject or discount approaches that focus on kama and artha, but see that that is just one piece of the puzzle, right? That is just one thing. And a book like Kali's Child, for example, and I've met the author. We've had cordial conversations, and again, I think we need to sort of see God in everyone. But he's written some things, of course, a lot of people in my tradition object to very strongly. And I think part of that comes from sort of using this reductionist lens as though that were the total explanation of the reality. And I think in that particular case, I don't think that was the intent that he set out with, but it appears that way. I mean, there are portions of the text where it seems that some of these sort of psychological speculations are being stated as historical facts, and that's really been the objection. I've known people in my tradition who've said that had he said, this is my interpretation or this is my reading, it would have been much less. I mean, people would have still disagreed with it and objected to it. And there have been criticisms of the use of Bengali, that the translations were not accurate and so on. So there would still be, I think, objections, but it wouldn't be at the level of offensiveness that I think many find it to be, because it's sort of stating this somewhat tangentious psychological interpretation as though it's a historical fact. And then other people, I've had much less cordial conversations with other people who are not the author of the book, but defenders of the author, who purely because it's written by a scholar from University of Chicago, the assumption is this is rigorous, cutting-edge scholarship, and if you object to it, you're a fundamentalist and you don't know what you're talking about, and so on. And at Chicago itself, that argument would not fly, right? I mean, that's not. You have to actually take the argument on that level. But I think with Anekantavad, what we can do is look at a perspective with which we might disagree and say, okay, there is truth there, right? Mm-hmm. There is something that the author is trying to express there, and that can be contextualized within a richer and fuller understanding that also incorporates the transcendental perspective, the practitioner's perspective, and so on. So that's what I was arguing for in that piece.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I also interviewed Professor Narasimha Sil recently, and he was pretty much saying very similar what you just mentioned, because he also knows Bengali language, and he was not comfortable with the translation by Jeffery Kirpal.
Yes,
in the book.
That's right.
Well,
so and Swami Tyagananda has written extensively about this. There's the book that he co-authored with Pravajika Vrajaprana, where he gives page after page of translations that he says are not accurate, not correct. When I actually spoke with Professor Kripal, I realized where the difference was in our understanding, because I asked him a question I had wanted to ask for many years, which was, okay, you've said you've kind of revealed this secret that's there in the Kathamrita, in the text that we call the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, right? But Bengalis have been reading the original text for a century. Why didn't they see this? And his answer was very interesting. He said, well, you have to have this sophisticated hermeneutic in order to perceive this. And then he said, it's just like the homoerotic images in the Christian Gospels. And then I realized, okay, we're just seeing the world through very different lenses, because my first thought as someone who grew up Catholic was, what homoerotic images in the Christian Gospels, right? What is he talking about? And, now there are passages that I know people mentioned, like where the disciple John is called the disciple that Jesus loves. And so there's this question, well, did they have some kind of special relationship that was different from everyone else and so on? But really, you have to, I think, almost be looking for those things in order to see those things. And you could conceivably see those things anywhere, right? And then this is actually what prompted Freud to make that famous remark. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, that you really, Wendy Doniger herself, actually, who's used this method, had some criticisms of it when I was in Chicago. She said the weakness of the Freudian method is that it's unfalsifiable. That is, there's no possible way to refute it Therefore, that means it's a circular argument. So just the very act of objecting to a Freudian interpretation can cause the Freudian to look at you and say, so what was your relationship with your mother like? It's to sort of, put the onus on you that you also are suffering from these unconscious maladies and so on. So it's kind of this impenetrable thing whereas a valid scientific claim there have to be conditions under which it could conceivably be proven wrong. Mm-hmm. And if you repeat those conditions, and if it holds up, then it holds up. But the Freudian interpretation is unfalsifiable. It is almost like a religious claim, mm-hmm. where you believe it or you don't. And so these are some of the difficulties I find with that.
Wonderful. I think we talked a lot, and we discussed on your Anekantvad and process theology connection. We discussed about your upcoming book on Hindus in America, the converging worldview, and hopefully we'll maybe in the next episode we can talk about your other projects, your past projects and your future projects.
Oh, I would be delighted to do that. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Pankaj, and happy that grateful that you thought it was worth your viewers' time to have me in your program.
I think thanks for your time, and hopefully it will be a start of a series of our conversations.
That would be wonderful. I would definitely look forward to that.
Right. Thank you, and namaste.
Thank you. Namaste.